Hi. Last week I was talking about science and faith, and I think at the end I said that this week we might look at the way in which we understand the Bible and how that helps us to understand that maybe there isn't such a conflict between science and faith, or indeed a conflict between our idea of what God should be like and what we think the Bible is saying. So it's important to understand the kind of writing that we're reading. It's important to understand what the writer was trying to do with this material. And once we understand that, it gives us a much rounder, clearer understanding of God himself, or at least the God that the Bible is describing for us. So let's take a wee look at Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. If we've got time, we might just have a look at Genesis 1, but anyway. So we all know the story of Genesis 1, how it, on the surface, describes the creation of the world in 7 days, and it gives the sequence of events over those 7 days. And many people will say, well, we know the world didn't happen like that, and science disproves that. And then they jump to like, well, you can't believe the Bible, you can't trust it from that conclusion. However, what if the writer was not trying to give us a literal description of the way the world began? What if he was doing something else? And I think he was. I think he wasn't writing history. He wasn't writing scientific account. He was writing something else, and what he was writing was highly significant and highly different from an understanding of God in those days. And I don't mean the account he gives of creation. We'll come to that. But in the way he talks about this, he comes at it in a way which is, I would use the word as pure revelation. He's got a picture here which is way different from any of the theological thinking of his time, theological thinking about other gods and about the way the world began. If you read Genesis 1, you will see the word good written over 20 times. I can't quite remember how many times, but the word good occurs many, many times. This was made and God saw that it was good. That was made and God saw that it was good. And so the writer is telling us something. He's telling us that God made a good world. And therefore, God is good. Now you might think, yeah, well, we know that. That's part of our understanding. But when this was written, it wasn't typical to think that gods were good. Gods could be unpredictable. They could be bad-tempered. They could be judgmental. They could be whimsical. They could need appeasing. They were all different kinds of gods with all different sorts of nature. And if you read about the Roman gods and the stories of these gods that come out of ancient literature, we see that the understanding of gods was very, very different. And sometimes they had to be appeased by making living sacrifices. Again, a cruel and dreadful thing. This writer is saying, hey, God is good, and everything he touches and makes is good. And he's saying something else as well. He's saying there is only one God, and this God made everything and he made it good. And so that's the message of Genesis chapter 1. And people get distracted, of course. They they see it as an attempt to describe the beginning of the world. And actually, as an attempt to describe the beginning of the world, it's not bad. The sequence of events tends to follow the scientific understanding of the way planet Earth developed. But the writer isn't trying to give us a kind of accurate scientific description. He's much more concerned to tell us that God is good and there is one God who is the creator of all things. And that's his message. And so that's why the word good occurs so many times. Everything that's made is made well, and it's made good, and it's made positively. And God looks at it and is pleased by it. So the world was made in a way which is wonderful. And of course, our experience of nature and of the way the world is made tends to agree with that. Many people will come to a place like Scotland and talk about the wonderful scenery and the beauty of the land. And actually, wherever we travel in the world, the natural sights are often very beautiful and very breathtaking. So the natural world is very beautiful. And the created world as well, the created world of animals, is very, very beautiful. And many of us are captivated and enchanted by the living world and are very keen followers of series like David Attenborough's Planet Earth series. And we just love to understand more and see more about the living world. So the writer in Genesis chapter 1 is saying, hey, it's great, it's good, it's wonderful. And that actually is pure revelation. It's an insight that nobody else had at that time. The idea that one God made everything, and this one God made these things very well, very good, very perfectly. So that's the message of Genesis chapter 1. So you might want to read it again and have a look at the word good and the idea that God is pleased with all these things. And ultimately the creation of people. And again, in the development of planet Earth, we arrived quite late. So it's a kind of accurate description of the way in which things developed and happened. But that's secondary. It's not the main function. I would say the main function is a theological function. So we're reading not history, not science, but theology. And as theology, it's wonderful theology. And it speaks to all of us about a good God. So that's all right, that's great. But we do have a problem. And the problem is that when we look at the world, we see that things aren't good or great, particularly in the human arena. We have this problem of people doing bad things. And although in Genesis chapter 1, the creation of humankind is good, it doesn't last very long. And actually, Genesis chapters 2 and 3 kind of agree with this. By the time we get to Genesis chapter 3, we encounter the very bad behavior of the first human beings and the murder of Abel by Cain. And what the writer is trying to do, again, he's not giving us a kind of literal description of what happened with the first people. I mean, that's not his point. His point is that he's given us a description of a good God who made a good world. But it's a world that has gone sadly wrong. I mean, the writer knows this. He looks around and it's a world of confusion and hostility and conflict. And so what he's trying to do in these chapters is give a reason. He's trying to tell us why, despite the fact that there's a very good God, things are not quite the way they were intended to be. And that's because human beings haven't behaved in a perfectly good way. And so he gives a story. And that story is the story of the murder of Abel by Cain, and the surrounding events. But again, the story isn't a literal description of what actually happened way back then. It's a story that seeks to enable us to understand why the Bible puts forward this idea of a good and perfect God, but we don't have a good and perfect humanity. So the writer is saying, hey, despite the fact that we were made good by God, we haven't held on to that. And even in the very beginning, things went wrong. And the writer locates our current problems and our current conflicts to that event. But that's a metaphor. It isn't meant to be taken, I don't think, literally. It's simply a metaphor to say, we are capable of loving and being kind, but we're also capable of making very bad choices. We're capable of being jealous. We're capable of being upset. And sometimes these emotions will control our behavior. These negative emotions will control our behavior. So the writer is trying to give a kind of account of the world as we find it in those 3 chapters. He's trying to make sense of the world as we find it and give a story that is realistic. And that's, I think, what Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 are about. And it's unwise to read them in any other kind of way. Read them as theology and as explanation of how the world that we experience actually is, despite the fact that a good and kind God has made it all. So there's Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Read it differently the next time you read it. See you next week.